You're listening to Searching for More, a podcast of the Diocese of Arlington. On this episode, Father Jamie Workman, the new Vicar General for the Diocese of Arlington, shares his personal faith journey and conversion story.
The connection and the coherency of the Catholic Church, with all of its ups and downs, in my mind, I started to realize that the continuity that I was looking to find to introduce me to Christ in an authentic way was in the church.
Hear Father Workman talk about what drew him to the Catholic faith and ultimately the priesthood. This episode's host is Billy Atwell, Chief Communications Officer of the Diocese.
Father Workman, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
I'm happy to be here, Billy. Excited about it. And yeah.
So you have taken on a very new role, for you at least. You're the new Vicar General for the diocese. We're going to get into that a little bit later on, but first I want to start with a little bit of your story, because one of the most fascinating is that I think this year's 14 years since you came into the church. Is that right?
Oh, actually, it's been just over 20 years now.
Oh, 20 years. Wow. Okay. So talk about how you got introduced to the Catholic Church and how you came to be Catholic.
Sure. It's actually quite an interesting story, at least from my perspective, and I'm happy to share it and have on occasion with different groups. And it actually goes back to my early childhood. I had the opportunity and blessing to know all of my great-grandmothers and three of my great-grandfathers, and they were all men and women of great faith, different denominations, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist. And watching them as I was growing up, sort of unchurched, really, they always had some element in which they were able to announce the gospel or announce their relationship with Christ or give witness to it just from the simplicity of day-to-day life. It wasn't like they were overbearing or they were preaching it directly to me, like, oh, you got to believe in Jesus. It was just a part of who they were. And they exuded that relationship very naturally. And so from an early age, I sort of had this mindfulness or awareness of God's presence in the world, I think just by witnessing their relationship with him. And so when I fast forward, it grew into my young adult years and I was working. I started sort of this open search, or I was a little bit more open to wanting to know more about God on a personal level. And I had the opportunity, maybe when I was 19 or 20 years old, to attend a student youth leadership conference in Williamsburg. And it was a situation where, if you remember, as a young adult, I was nominated to go by a family member. I felt obligated to go. I didn't really necessarily feel like I wanted to be there, but I went out of obligation, and I thought sort of that young adult mindset, well, I'll just go down, I'll meet some other young adults that are similarly minded, don't want to be there, and we'll go off and do our own thing, and then we'll come back and then say it was a great conference, But what I encountered was a whole bunch of young adults that were on fire for being there. I couldn't find somebody that didn't want to be there, and I couldn't understand why. But then it started to sink in that this was a Christian-based leadership conference. We had prayer together, we had small groups, we read scripture together, we had a service project, we had great keynote speakers about applying the faith. And I walked away from that conference inspired in a new way, because it was the first time in my life I think I had encountered peers that had a real zeal for Christ. And I walked away saying, I want that same zeal in my life. At the same time, there was another component in which I had this awareness. I probably couldn't have formulated it any other way than this at the time, that if Jesus loved me as much as I understood and came into the world because of his great love for humanity, wanting to win salvation, then it wasn't as if he had done all these wonderful things and then ascended into heaven and said, good luck with all of that. That there was somebody out there that was going to be able to, in a real way, in an authentic way, introduce me into the mysteries of the life of Christ. So I didn't want to just start showing up at a random neighborhood church that was conveniently located to me. And I wanted to take time to really look and say, where am I going to find that authentic connection to Christ that I was looking for in my life. And then simultaneously, I was saying to myself, but I'm not going to be Catholic. Like, I'm not going to start out being
You had your
Catholic.
standards after all.
Right, exactly, yeah. And obviously, I think that was just more out of my own ignorance and not really understanding, what the church is, and not really being raised in a particular faith. But I started down that avenue of just reaching out and looking and trying to study, not from a strictly academic point, but speaking with people that I knew were practicing in different denominations from the Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian backgrounds, but also had a number of friends who were Catholic and just talking about their experiences in the church. And I started watching all of those televangelists, and especially in the evenings, I had that downtime, and one person that stuck out at that time was Mother Angelica.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the reason was that she was not what I expected. When you grow up outside of the church, your only perception maybe of sisters and consecrated religious is what's portrayed maybe in movies or in the media, and quite often you can get the perception that they're removed from society, that there's sort of a stiffness or rigidity to who they may be, and but she wasn't any of that. And she was laughing, and she was making me laugh, and it started to break down any sort of barriers, I think, in my own heart towards thinking about the church. And along those times, I was buying different versions of sacred scripture, different translations, and just trying to do a comparison. Not that I knew anything; I'd never studied in-depth sacred scripture, but that's how God moved me. And I remember going to a Barnes and Nobles when they were everywhere, and I walked by the register, and there was a shelf of discounted books that they were selling, and one of them was a Bible for $10. I think if you see a Bible for $10, buy the Bible.
Right.
So I grabbed it. I didn't really pay much attention to what it was, bought it, took it home, opened it up immediately to the book of the Maccabees, which really struck me because I'd never heard of the book of the Maccabees.
Right.
And I closed the Bible, I looked at the cover, and it was the New American Bible, St. Joseph edition for Catholics. And I grabbed the other Bibles that I had, and I started looking down the indices, and I discovered what I since learned is the Deuterocanonical, those books of the Old Testament that are a part of our heritage in the church that are not in the Protestant Bibles. And there was this moment right, exactly. And there was this moment of grace in my life, and I really believe that. Once somebody asked me, how did you come into the church? How did you find the faith? And I mentioned that it was a really graced moment. And the person in response said, well, I know it was grace, but what led you to the conversion? But I really believe that because I don't know how else to explain this moment where everything that I had learned when I saw that book of the Maccabees and I was engaged in this moment, that everything I learned from a secular university, George Mason University, on Western civilization and history came flooding into my mind. And the connection and the coherency of the Catholic Church with all of its ups and downs came to my mind. I started to realize that the continuity that I was looking to find to introduce me to Christ in an authentic way was in the church.
How old were you at this time?
I was about 20 years old.
Oh, okay. So you're in college, but early on in college.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
That's fascinating. Now, let me back up just a little bit.
Sure.
What was it that beforehand put you off to the Catholic Church? You said, I want to be Christian, but certainly not a Catholic. What was it that you had maybe thought going in Catholics believed, or what was it about Catholicism that didn't attract you on its face?
Yeah, I think some of it was just sort of the casual beliefs that, religion maybe was just merely a man-made mechanism for relating to God. and the structures of the church and the sort of what you can visibly see from the outside looking in seemed very, very rigid to me.
The bureaucracy,
the bureaucracy, and again, a lot of that had to do with, I mean, just a lot of lack of understanding about faith and tradition in terms of the handing on of the faith and transmission of revelation, but also I think another level was the humanness. I knew a lot of Catholics who were nominal Catholics. They weren't necessarily practicing their faith. It didn't seem to be any more important to them than anybody else that I encountered or met. So I think it was the human aspect, and then also sort of seeing the structure, not understanding how God can use that structure in a person's life to draw us closer to himself.
It is so ironic, though, that the institution of the church is what was putting you off at first, and now you've been a canon lawyer, you've worked as a judge in our tribunal, and now a vicar general. That's like I've noticed. I have a couple friends who have converted. One's priest and one's not. One was really put off by the idea of Mary. Could not get over that. Now has a huge Marian devotion. Right. The other, the Eucharist, that was the big hurdle. And of course, he's a priest. He's consecrating the Eucharist, and so it's just funny how God could use that big hang up as something that's a major part of your ministry. Obviously, later. So you're at that phase. What was the catalyst that led to the actual entering RCIA and coming into the church?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I really didn't know what to personally do at that moment. You have this conviction. I had this awareness and conviction, like what I'm looking for is in the church, but how do I actualize that? I actually need to go to Mass.
Where's the door?
Right. And there was also, I think, a little hesitation and fear in the sense that some of my family were a little bit more, again, maybe anti-Catholic at the time. Not necessarily that they disliked Catholics per se, but just the idea of the church, that was there. And I didn't know what they were going to think or to say. And so I had to test out the waters by putting it out there to my family before I started down a formalized path. And I remember, again, 20 years old, I was in a car ride with my mother, and I've told this story many times in public, so I'm not saying anything she hasn't heard me say before.
All right, good. We don't want to get you in trouble.
Right, exactly. So we were in a car ride. We're going through, what I was experiencing, where I was in the beginnings of this conversion, and why I was being drawn to the church. And I'll never forget this. She said, "Well, you're an adult. You can make that decision. Just don't come home and tell me you want to be a priest."
This is another one of those, you draw the line in the sand and God's like, oh, so that's where I need to go. That's so funny.
Yeah. So I think part of it is that, again, from her perspective, any parent's perspective, that, what is it that parents want for their children? They want them to be happy and flourish, in this world. And if a parent in particular doesn't have an experience of a happy, flourishing priestly vocation, then they fear that their son could never be happy in such a vocation.
Right.
And that was something that she had to learn, and she's done a complete 180 on all of that over the years, and she's become very supportive and prayerfully supportive of the vocation.
So who was running, or the chaplain at George Mason at the time?
It was Father Bob Solinsky.
What a wonderful priest! What a compassionate man to bring you into the church too.
I remember. I had a friend that I'd asked to take me to Mass for the very first time. It was, I can tell you, it was the second, I can't remember the exact date, but I know it was the Sunday after Labor Day in 1996. And I had asked, I need somebody to go with me. I need a Catholic that knows what's going on. And I remember very, very vividly, even though I didn't know what was coming next, whether I was going to be standing, sitting, kneeling, making the sign of the cross. It was the first time in my life, I walked away with this notion that it was the first time in my life that I had truly felt that I worshiped Christ. And I think when I look back, it's because I was doing it with my whole personhood, body and soul and mind. It wasn't just sitting there as I had done in some other services, just listening passively. There was an integrated participation I was giving, and I also think there was something spiritually being tugged upon in my heart about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which I had yet to learn about. Knowing that there was something special that mysterious about that I didn't understand.
Yeah.
And I met Father Bob immediately after that Mass, and told him that I wanted to come into the church. And he said, "That's great. Just come to RCIA tomorrow evening, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, here at the chapel." And I did. The next night I was back and started those classes.
That's great. Father Bob has planted so many seeds along the way. I mean, some development priests. I had to get my HVAC replaced this weekend, and the guy who did the sales kind of set it all up for the guys to come do the work. Said I was wearing a diocesan polo shirt. I'd come from an event. He said, "Oh, you work for the diocese? I know Father Bob Solinsky." And he said, if it wasn't for Father Bob, I don't know if I'd still be going to church. And he just talks about how instrumental Father Bob was at a very tough time of his life. But it's beautiful to see the ministry of a priest work like that. And you plant seeds that you never really necessarily grow. I don't know if Father Bob, I've got to talk to him about it. So how did you, so you come into the church, again, that institutional church is what kind of put you off first. You become a priest. I realize the 14-year I mentioned before, that's how long, I guess, since you've been ordained a priest, probably, right? 14 or 15 years. Yeah. So you've been a priest for that long. When did you start feeling this desire to study canon law? Because you've done all these very, challenging roles within the administration of the church, in addition to your pastoral work as a priest. Well,
it's interesting you put it in those terms. I mean, actually, when I discerned the priesthood, it was really with the notion, and this is, when I say discern, I mean not only before I went to seminary, but all through seminary and the formation that I was blessed to receive at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, that my mind and my heart were really on just following Christ. I had this sense that Christ was calling me to give my life to Him and to the church in this way, and my passion and my zeal really were for parish priesthood. And Arlington, I mean, a lot of times, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and a lot of times I run into Catholics back from Pennsylvania. They'll say to me, "Oh, you're from Pennsylvania. Why don't you come back? I mean, we're in need of priests here." But my response to that is, but Arlington became my Catholic home. It's where I found the faith. It's where God drew the vocation and made me aware of a priestly vocation. And
I can see why that would be very different.
Right. You know, and so this quickly became my home, and where I saw God calling me to serve. And so when you talk about the idea of studying canon, that was the furthest thing from my mind as I was coming into priesthood. I was ordained. My first assignment at Blessed Sacrament in Alexandria, visiting the hospitals, being involved with the Knights of Columbus, the young adult ministry, the school, marriage prep. All of that was like receiving a fulfillment of my heart's desire to serve the Lord. And I felt whole and complete. And so when Bishop Laverty asked me he really asked me, and he made it very clear that he was asking me if I would go and study canon law at Catholic University full time and leave parish ministry for that time. It was not on my radar at all. It was something that others, I guess, had seen, or the others had discerned was needed, and because of my trust in how the Holy Spirit works through the bishop and his discernment for gifts and assignments, I humbly said yes, knowing that there would be that maybe it would be a while before I got back to sort of that parochial ministry that is very much a part of our hearts.
I remember before Father De Laterante went to Rome for an assignment, when he got the call, that he said, "Well, I didn't become a priest to say no."
Right.
And I always thought that was such a beautiful and simple way to understand any vocation. Welcoming kids into a family. Sometimes it's stressful. And things. But well, I didn't become a husband to say no. But that's beautiful to see you take that on, because I've worked with you for a few years now. You're a very bright guy, so I see why people saw that in you. But to take that on, not thinking that was something that you necessarily wanted to do. So after you studied canon law, you became a canon lawyer, you got your degree in that. What was the nature of the work you did then at the Chancery?
Well, I was when I finished my coursework and completed my degree in May of 2013, Bishop Laverty immediately assigned me to the chancery full time and working in the tribunal as well. And the name of the office was changed from just merely the tribunal to the Office of Canonical Affairs and the tribunal, because when one of our former Vicars General retired, they took some of his administrative duties and they asked me to take them on.
Okay.
Things like marriage dispensations, permissions, working and helping with those that wanted to transfer their rite, which means like a Latin Catholic wanting to become an Eastern Catholic, or an Eastern Catholic becoming a Latin Catholic. And working with sort of that administrative duty, and then also serving as a full-time defender of the bond.
What does that mean?
Defender of the bond, in the formal annulment process, there involves a couple of officers, and one is, of course, the judge or judges that might make up the court, but then also the advocates of the parties. And then the defender of the bond sort of plays a role in which they ensure and they watch over the procedural application of the law and how the case develops, to make sure that there's no anomalies present there, and that the rights of both parties have been protected. And it's the defender of the bond's role to make any observation that the procedural norms have not been followed to the judge or judges in the case. But then also in terms of the argumentation, to sort of play, as I put it, the devil's advocate, in that somebody's presenting their testimonies and evidences and proofs for why the church would overturn a presumption of validity of their past marriage, or their former bond, or with their spouse, and so that if and when the judge writes an affirmative decision, it's not a straw man. It's not just checking off boxes or pro forma. It's really been examined. So if the defender raises any objection, the judge or judges, when they write the sentence, have to address and overcome those objections. And it becomes a stronger sentence, really.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've heard you talk about before is when you're dealing with, especially annulments, it's something that's so sensitive to people, but it is a legal process within the church in order to receive what's called a declaration of nullity. Talk about that whole process as a ministry, though. As like a ministry of the church, because you've described that in a way before that I thought more people should hear that.
Sure. First of all, anytime someone's bringing their past forward, it can be very emotionally difficult circumstance. But when it comes to the tribunal, it's not just filling out a form or checking off boxes. Person is coming to the pastors of the church, and they're able to lay out their story in a way that it's received, that there's an accompaniment, not only by the judges or the court officials, but also, the number of times someone has said in a hearing, Father, this has been so good for me because it's the first time I've ever told this story in front of a priest. It's the first time I've been able to open my heart or my past that is very painful in many cases to the church. And so the judges are very professional, and the defenders of the bond that we have in our tribunal are professional to be sensitive to that reality. And we also are able to, in many cases, connect them to counseling to start processing those past wounds and be given the tools that they need spiritually and humanly in the life of the church, regardless of the answer that they may receive from their petition, whether it's an affirmative or a negative at that time. And I think there's also another dimension that is pastoral, and that is the proclamation of the dignity of marriage. It's not. Any declaration of nullity is not merely and should never be seen as a Catholic divorce.
Right.
We're looking back at the beginning of a marriage, saying, was there something missing that kept this bond that we're examining from forming in the way that the church intends, or the way that Christ intended? the fact that somebody's coming, whether they're a non-Catholic, whether they're a practicing fully formed Catholic, or whether it's a Catholic that's been away from the church for many years, there's an enunciation, passively and actively, that the reason we're here is because of Christ's message in the Gospel of Matthew about the permanent nature of marriage, the oneness of marriage. And so we're able to walk pastorally with someone who's coming to grips with that. It's either affirming that in somebody, or it's drawing that attention to somebody for the very first time.
Wow.
So it is an accompaniment, and there is a deeply spiritual component to it. That part of it is the encouragement that I would have for anybody petitioning, and anybody whose former spouse may be petitioning, is to be open to what God might be working in your life. Because while there may be a lot of emotional difficulties in the memories that are being brought up, ultimately it's through that, if we're open to it, that God can work miracles of healing.
That's beautiful. So you're in this role that's new for you. It's the role of Vicar General. Describe just in broad terms what, no matter the diocese, what is the essential function of a Vicar General?
Sure. Being appointed Vicar General, every diocese is asked to have appointed at least one Vicar General. You can have more than one. And that's discernment of the bishop, or either because of the needs that he has or the way in which he wishes to structure the diocese based on its size and pastoral needs. But it's a share in the ordinary executive governance of the bishop over the whole diocese. And that's in contrast to maybe what some are given the title as Episcopal vicars, which they share in the same ordinary executive power, but in a specific ministry, or in a specific area. So, for example, sometimes a diocese might have an Episcopal vicar for the Spanish apostolate.
Okay.
And so their governance and sharing with the bishop's governance and exercising it come in that capacity, whereas the Vicar General,
right,
the time is over the whole diocese.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. Very good.
And then practically speaking, it can mean, as you alluded to before, it can mean different things in different dioceses in terms of the bishop's vision and how he wants that ministry to be exercised.
Very good. So there was also some other changes in terms of the structure of how a lot of the ministries that typically fell under the Vicar General role are going to be shared. So talk a little bit about what you'll be overseeing and how you'll be functioning in the role.
Sure. So so the structure that you're discussing has to do with we've made the announcement of hiring Ward Jones, our new Chief Operating Officer, and he'll be overseeing the operational offices like information technology, HR, child protection, risk management, and legal counsel and the like. And then the other pastoral offices, I will be overseeing those directors. So the Office of Marriage, Family and Respect Life, the Office of Youth, Young Adult and Campus Ministries, the Office of Catholic Schools, the Victims Assistance, the Divine Worship, and so the pastoral, the Multicultural Ministries, Spanish Apostolate, the pastoral arm or the pastoral mission of the bishop in the church, those offices, which makes sense that the bishop is asking a priest to be more directly involved in guiding and bringing his vision to those offices. Very
good, very good. So when Bishop Burbidge asked you to be the Vicar General, that demonstrates a tremendous trust. Personally, what was your reaction when he asked? I was
overwhelmed with humility, actually. I was humbled by that because it was immediately perceiving the confidence and the level of trust that goes into making such an appointment and undergoing such a discernment. And I'll share with you that when he formally asked me to take on this role, and I accepted in the vein of what you were saying before, that I wasn't ordained to say no.
Yeah.
The first thing we did together in that moment was to go before the Blessed Sacrament and pray together for the Diocese of Arlington. And to begin that in a spirit of humility and prayer and trusting the ministries under that patronage care of the Blessed Mother and the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
That's wonderful. That's very good. Any final thoughts for those listening about, the nature of your work and what you'll be doing as, in serving the bishop and helping him carry out his ministry?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people ask me on a practical level. I think it's the number one question I get is, what is a vicar general?
Yeah.
and my aside from the sort of administrative role and assisting the bishop in these pastoral ministries, it's not so much what I have to say is that it is just a simple request. It's one that I make and of many of our parishioners after masses, and that is just for continued prayer, prayerful support. Any ministry that a priest undertakes or anyone undertakes, we can really only be successful through the graces and merits of Jesus Christ. And that's the only way in which I think I could be successful in assisting the bishop and bringing the message of the gospel in a joyful and hope-filled manner to the people of the Diocese of Arlington.
Very good. Well, thank you for your time here. Thank you for telling us a little bit about your story and sharing, your backstory with the people that, you'll be serving, in this ministry as Vicar General, and for all your hard work. Just know that we're praying for you as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's great to be here.
You're listening to Searching for More. If you enjoyed this podcast, please write a review on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Also, make sure you follow the Diocese and the Arlington Catholic Herald on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to our YouTube channels for regular videos that inspire, educate, and inform about the Catholic faith in our diocesan community.